Welcome back to the Qualified Expert Series from Subthesis. The standing note: this course is education about the expert determination pathway, not a certification, and nothing here is legal advice. Last video gave you the adversaries, the risk equation, and a lot of arithmetic. Today we finish Module 4 with the question that decides every engagement. What number counts as very small, and how you defend the number you choose. Fair warning, this is another long one, roughly 40 minutes, because a lesson about picking a number that contains no arithmetic would be exactly the failure it is warning you about. Subscribe if the series is earning its place, and the full roadmap is at subthesis.com. The regulator gives you no number, so the number you pick is only as good as your defense of it. That is the entire subject of this video, and it is where expert determinations are won or lost, because a threshold asserted bare is an opinion, while a threshold anchored in precedent and context is a professional judgment that survives review. The good news is that you are not the first person to face this. Federal agencies, state health departments, international standards bodies, and 2 decades of peer-reviewed methodology have left a trail of traced, citable benchmarks. A cell size of 11 at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, 9% in clinical trial transparency, 5% in the landmark Canadian public release literature, and one famous number that does not survive tracing, which you need to know so you never cite it. Today we do 4 things. We grade every one of those numbers for provenance, including one number this course itself uses that is weaker than practitioners admit. We convert thresholds into cell sizes and back, with the rounding trap that catches people. We work a complementary suppression by hand until the algebra is visible. And we release our Springfield dataset twice, at 2 different thresholds, and watch one release become impossible and the other land on the line exactly. 5 objectives today. First, you will be able to grade a threshold by its provenance, sorting every number you hear into traced and strong, traced and moderate, or commonly repeated and untraced. And you will apply that grading honestly, including to numbers this course uses. Second, you will be able to convert freely between a minimum cell size and a maximum risk probability in both directions, and you will know why a strict 9% ceiling does not actually mean a cell size of 11. Third, you will be able to apply the cell size regimes that agencies actually enforce: the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services suppression policy, the California guidelines, and the National Health Statistics rules, including complementary suppression worked by hand. Fourth, you will be able to apply the 5 safes framework and score it against evidence, so a context assessment produces documents rather than adjectives. And fifth, you will be able to write the threshold paragraph of a determination report and answer the 2 challenges reviewers actually raise. Precedents first, because they are the ground everything else stands on. Here are the numbers a reviewer will recognize, each with its paper trail. Anchor 1, cell size 11. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services cell size suppression policy forbids reporting any cell describing between 1 and 10 Medicare beneficiaries and requires complementary suppression so masked values cannot be recovered by subtraction. California's health data de-identification guidelines adopt the same floor. Numerators below 11 do not get published. A minimum class of 11 is arithmetic for a maximum risk of 1 over 11, about 9%, and slide 6 shows why the word about matters there. Anchor 2. That same 9% appears independently as a maximum risk benchmark in clinical trial transparency, codified in the European Medicines Agency's Policy 0070 and Health Canada's Public Release of Clinical Information Regime, where the public context assumes an attempt probability of 1.0. Anchor 3, 5%. The landmark peer-reviewed de-identification of Canada's National Hospital Discharge Abstract Database set maximum acceptable risk at roughly 0.04 to 0.05 for public use microdata, and that literature, from Elamam and colleagues, remains the strictest commonly cited public release standard. Behind them sit the legacy cell size rules of 3 and 5 from the Federal Statistical Agency's Working Paper 22, historically real, largely superseded in health data by 11. Notice something about all three strong anchors. Every one of them names a release context: public microdata, public clinical trial documents, published beneficiary tables. Not one is a general statement about health data as such, which means quoting any of them without naming your context misuses it. And in the corner sits the 33% rule, which practitioners cite constantly and which does not trace to identity risk at all. We will give it a full slide because knowing why a number is wrong is more useful than knowing that it is. Before you cite anything, grade it, using 3 tiers you can apply in about a minute. Tier 1, traced and strong. There is a primary source, an agency policy, a regulation, or a peer-reviewed paper that states the number for a purpose close to yours. Cell size 11 earns this, twice over, from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Suppression Policy and the California De-Identification Guidelines. 0.09 earns it from Clinical Trial Transparency Policy in Europe and Canada. 0.05 earns it from the Canadian Discharge Abstract Database work, a peer-reviewed public microdata release. Tier 2, traced but moderate. A real primary source exists, but the context has moved. The legacy cell sizes of 3 and 5 sit here. Working Paper 22 genuinely discusses threshold rules for cell suppression, and they were genuinely used, but health data practice has moved to 11, so citing 3 today invites the question of why you reached backward. Tier 3, commonly repeated and untraced for your purpose. Someone can point at a document, but the document is about something else. The 33% rule lives here permanently. Now the Tier 3 admission this course owes you. The 0.20 enclave threshold, the one I have used since the last video, is practice-derived. It appears in the methodological literature as a threshold an expert might allow in a highly secure, restricted access enclave, and it is defensible in that framing, but it is not codified in any regulation or agency policy, and I have not shown you a primary source that says 20% in the way I showed you one that says 11. Say that out loud in your reports. A number you have graded honestly survives challenge. A number you have oversold does not. Every cell size rule is a probability threshold wearing different clothes, and you must be able to translate in both directions on demand. Going from cell size to risk is division. A minimum class size of 3 gives a maximum prosecutor risk of 1 over 3, 0.333. A minimum of 5 gives 1 over 5, 0.20. A minimum of 11 gives 1 over 11, 0.0909. A minimum of 20 gives 1 over 20, 0.05 exactly. Going the other way, from a threshold to a cell size, is division and then rounding up, because k must be a whole number. The rule is K equals the ceiling of 1 divided by the threshold. A threshold of 0.05 gives 1 divided by 0.05, which is 20 exactly, so K of 20. A threshold of 0.20 gives 5, so K of 5. Now the trap. A threshold of 0.09 gives 1 divided by 0.09, which is 11.11, and the ceiling of 11.11 is 12. So a strictly enforced ceiling of 0.09 actually requires a minimum class size of 12, not 11, because 1 over 11 is 0.0909, which is very slightly above 0.09. Practitioners and policies treat 11 and 9% as equivalent, and in the real world that rounding gap is inconsequential, but you should know it is there, and you should never let a reviewer be the one who notices it. And here is the irony worth carrying. The untraced 33% rule is numerically identical to the legacy K of 3 rule, 1 over 3. People reciting the modern-sounding percentage are reciting the oldest and weakest cell size rule in the field. This is the policy most expert determinations lean on, so learn its 4 rules precisely rather than approximately. Rule 1. Scope. It applies to all tables, all text, and all charts describing beneficiaries, procedures, and diagnoses. Not just tables. If a sentence in your narrative says 7 patients in that county received the procedure, you have violated the policy in prose, and people do this constantly in the discussion sections of reports. Rule 2. The band. No cell reporting between 1 and 10 individuals may be published. 10 is inside the band and must be masked. 11 is the first publishable count. Rule 3, and this is the one people get wrong in both directions. 0 is publishable. A cell of 0 does not violate the minimum cell size requirement and may be displayed because a non-event cannot be linked to a person. Nobody is identified by the fact that nothing happened. Analysts routinely suppress zeros out of misplaced caution, and doing so destroys utility for no privacy gain, while other analysts suppress the small counts and then leave a total that gives them away. Rule 4. Derived values. The minimum applies not only to raw counts but to anything computed from them. A percentage, a rate, a ratio, or a total that reveals or permits reconstruction of a cell in the 1 to 10 band is itself a violation. That means a rate with a denominator of 8 is a violation, even though no count appears on screen. And built on Rule 4 is the requirement for complementary suppression, which the policy states explicitly, because masking one cell while publishing its row total and neighbors accomplishes nothing at all. The next slide proves that by doing it. Let us make this concrete with our own data. Take the Springfield discharge extract, fully synthetic, and scale it by 10 so we have a 100 record file with the same shape. Cross-sex against payer. Females, 30 commercial, 20 Medicaid, 10 Medicare, row total 60. Males, 20 commercial, 10 Medicaid, 10 Medicare, row total 40. Column totals: commercial 50, Medicaid 30, Medicare 20, grand total 100. Now apply the 1 to 10 band. 3 cells sit at exactly 10, female Medicare, male Medicaid, and male Medicare, and all 3 must be masked. Start with the naive move. Mask the female Medicare cell and publish everything else. A reader takes the female row total of 60, subtracts 30 and 20, and recovers 10. The suppression bought nothing. This is the algebraic reverse engineering the policy warns about, and it is not clever, it is subtraction. So you suppress complementarily. Mask a second cell in the same row, the female Medicaid cell of 20, even though 20 was perfectly publishable on its own. Now the row tells a reader only that 2 hidden cells sum to 30, and the pair columns are similarly ambiguous, so no individual value is recoverable. Notice the cost. To protect a cell of 10, you sacrificed a cell of 20. There is a second option that often preserves more. Collapse categories. Merge Medicaid and Medicare into a single public payer column. Females become 30 commercial and 30 public. Males become 20 commercial and 20 public. Every cell now clears 11. Nothing is masked, and the table publishes intact with less granularity but no holes. And for contrast, scale the same 10 rows by 100 instead of 10, and every cell lands at 100 or more, so the table publishes untouched. Sample size, not cleverness, is what makes tables safe. Cell size 11 is not the whole story, and if you work with state health data, you will meet regimes that go further. Start with California. The Health and Human Services Data De-Identification Guidelines set 2 conditions, not 1. The numerator must be at least 11, which is the familiar rule, but the denominator population must also be large enough, and the guidelines assess denominators below 20,000 as carrying geographic and demographic isolation risk. Think about why. A count of 15 is comfortably above 11, but 15 out of a population of 200 is a rate of 7.5% in a community small enough that everybody knows everybody, and the neighbors can narrow the 15 without any statistics at all. Numerator rules protect against the arithmetic of small cells. Denominator rules protect against the sociology of small places. An expert who checks only the numerator has done half the job. Now the National Health Statistics side. Guidance from the National Center for Health Statistics and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention adds 2 familiar constraints. Suppress statistics that are too small to be reliable or to protect confidentiality, which fuses the statistical reliability question with the privacy question, because an unstable rate is both untrustworthy and revealing. And aggregate age to at least 5 year groups, with a total denominator of at least 5,000 across demographic breakdowns. Note what the age rule does to your transformation plan. If you were planning single-year ages inside a public product, that plan is already out of step with federal statistical practice, regardless of what your risk metric says. When your engagement touches state or federal reporting, cite the applicable regime by name in your report, and show that your transformation satisfies the stricter of it and your own threshold. You will hear the 33% rule cited with total confidence, sometimes by people senior to you, so learn the history well enough to be gracious about it. Statistical Policy Working Paper 22, published by the Disclosure Limitations Subcommittee of the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, is a real and foundational document. It distinguishes 2 kinds of tables. Frequency tables count respondents, how many people fall in a cell, and there the disclosure limitation methods are threshold rules on the number of respondents, which is the ancestry of every cell size rule we have discussed. Magnitude tables report aggregate quantities, the total value of shipments from businesses in a county, total payroll, total production. For magnitude tables, the paper develops the P% rule, and here is its actual definition, which almost nobody quotes correctly. A cell is suppressed if a small coalition of respondents in that cell could use their own known values to estimate another respondent's contribution to within P% of its true value. It is a rule about how precisely a competitor can infer your revenue. In economic statistics, P is often set to 33. That is where the number comes from. Now watch the drift. Practitioners heard 33%, dropped the P% machinery, dropped the magnitude data context, dropped the attribute inference framing, and reported a 0.33 maximum probability of identity disclosure in health microdata. Every step of that translation is unsupported. The paper is a primary source for the P% rule in business magnitude data. It is not a source for an identity risk threshold on patients. How do you say this to a client without insulting them? Not by declaring the number wrong. Say that you traced it, that the trail leads to working paper 22, that the rule there governs magnitude data rather than identity, and that you would rather cite something a reviewer can verify. If the last several slides left you hoping someone would finally just publish the correct number, here is the international consensus, and it is a refusal. The ISO and IEC standard 27559, the Privacy Enhancing Data De-Identification Framework, acknowledges that legal regimes across jurisdictions differ in what they demand, and declines to specify a universal numeric threshold. What it requires instead is documentation. The assumptions you made, the threat model you adopted, the data environment the release lives in, and the basis for whatever threshold you chose, all written down for that specific case. Read that as the international restatement of the HIPAA expert determination standard itself, which likewise names no number and instead names a person, a method, and a documentation duty. 2 consequences for your practice. First consequence, stop looking for permission. There is no authority that will hand you a number and absorb the responsibility for it. The precedents we graded are anchors that make your reasoning legible to a reviewer, not substitutes for reasoning. Second consequence, and this is the more useful one, the standard tells you what a defensible determination looks like structurally, independent of the number. It looks like an explicit threat model, an explicit environment description, an explicit assumption list, and an explicit basis paragraph tying the chosen threshold to both. If those 4 things are present and coherent, a reviewer can disagree with your number and still find your work professional. If they are absent, the most conservative threshold in the world will not save you, because nobody can tell whether the number means anything. The number is the conclusion. The documentation is the determination. Why does one dataset support 2 different defensible thresholds? Because of last video's equation. Overall risk is the attempt probability times the success probability, and context sets the first factor. At one end of the spectrum sits the public release, a file anyone can download. There, you must assume the attempt probability is 1.0. Every adversary model is live, every auxiliary dataset is in play, and the environmental levers are gone. That is why the public precedents are the strict ones. Maximum risk of 5 to 9%, class sizes of 11 or more, and every transformation doing heavy lifting. At the other end sits the locked enclave, a vetted researcher reaching the data through a remote desktop that blocks downloads, exports, and printing, under a contract that forbids re-identification, inside an environment with audit logs. There, the attempt probability is genuinely, demonstrably low, and the methodological literature supports tolerating a higher success factor. A maximum risk of 0.20 appears in practice for tightly controlled environments, precisely because the overall product, attempt times success, stays very small. Recall the arithmetic from the last video. 1.0 times 0.09 gives 0.09, while 0.05 times 0.20 gives 0.01, so the looser-looking release is the safer one overall. Between the poles lies the everyday middle, data use agreement releases to research partners, where intermediate thresholds are justified control by control. Two disciplines keep this honest. State the release model in the report before stating the threshold, because the number has no meaning without it. And remember from video 4 that the same source data may legitimately ship at different strictness to different recipients, each release independently justified. Context assessment needs structure, or it degenerates into vibes. The structure this field borrowed is the 5 safes, developed for the United Kingdom's National Statistics Office and credited largely to Felix Ritchie, now standard scaffolding in health data governance. 5 questions, each generating evidence your report can cite. Safe projects. Is the use appropriate? A peer-reviewed epidemiology study under ethics board oversight weighs differently than commercial profiling, and the project's purpose belongs in your context section. Safe people. Can the users be trusted? Vetted researchers, mandatory privacy training, institutional accountability. Every yes lowers the attempt probability with evidence attached. Safe settings. Does the environment limit misuse, encrypted transfer, monitored cloud tenancy, or the gold standard, a remote access enclave where raw records physically cannot leave? Safe data, the pillar you already own, the transformations and risk measurements of modules 3 and 4, the success probability made small. And safe outputs, the one beginners forget. Whatever leaves the environment, tables, charts, model results, must itself be screened, and the standard screen is the cell size 11 rule applied to everything outbound, so no small cell slips out in a regression appendix. The framework's power is that the pillars trade against each other explicitly. Strong projects, people, and settings justify gentler treatment of the data pillar, and that justification is exactly what slides into a determination report as the reasoned basis for the chosen threshold. 5 headings, 5 bodies of evidence, 1 defensible number at the end. Notice that 4 of the 5 pillars are about people, purposes, environments, and outputs, rather than about the data itself, which is why an expert who brings only statistics will underperform on exactly the half of the assessment that buys back utility. The next slide turns each heading into an evidence test, because a pillar you cannot document is a pillar you cannot rely on. Here's how to score the 5 safes so the assessment produces artifacts rather than adjectives. Safe projects. The proof is an approved protocol, an ethics board approval letter, or the recitals and purpose clause of the executed agreement. The weak answer is the recipient telling you the work is for research. Research is a category, not evidence. Safe people. The proof is a signed agreement naming individuals, completed privacy training records, and an institutional affiliation you verified. The weak answer is that they are a reputable organization. Reputation is not a control, it is a feeling about a control. Safe settings. The proof is an architecture description, an attestation or audit report, screenshots or configuration exports showing export and removable media restrictions, and access logs that actually exist. The weak answer is that the data will be kept securely. Safe data. The proof is your own work, the equivalence class distribution, the computed risk metrics, the transformation log, the estimator and sampling fraction. This is the pillar you cannot outsource. Safe outputs. The proof is a written output screening procedure, naming a threshold, a named reviewer, and a log of screened outputs. The weak answer is that researchers will only publish aggregates. Aggregates are exactly where small cells escape. Now the part that matters most. 2 pillars are load-bearing, meaning if they collapse, your whole threshold argument collapses with them. Safe settings, because it is the pillar that actually prevents copies from walking out rather than merely forbidding it. And safe outputs, because it is the only pillar that governs what happens after your analysis ends. Score all 5 before you choose the number, not after, because the score is the argument for the number. Now inventory the controls themselves, because your report must name each one it relies on. The centerpiece is the data use agreement, and 6 clauses matter most. A prohibition on re-identification. The recipient may not attempt to identify anyone, directly or indirectly. A prohibition on linking. No merging with voter files, consumer databases, or any external source without written consent, and this clause alone disables the classic attack. A no contact clause. Nobody in the data may ever be approached. Breach notification. Unauthorized access gets reported to you immediately. Onward transfer limits. The data goes to no third party unless bound by identical terms consistent with the original purpose. And audit rights. The provider may inspect the recipient's environment and practices. Every clause is a legal weight on the attempt probability, and each one you rely on gets named in the determination, with the section number, not just the concept. Beside the contract sits the technical inventory. Multi-factor authentication and role-based access control, encryption at rest and in transit, network segmentation, and at the strong end, the secure enclave, which gets its own slide next. Plus operational hygiene, log review that would actually notice anomalous query behavior rather than log collection that nobody reads. One more dial the literature is candid about, the data itself. Psychiatric records, substance use treatment, HIV status, and genomic data raise the target value for extortion and voyeurism, which raises the attempt probability, which argues for tighter treatment even inside good controls. The framework endorsing this trade is broad, from El Imam's methodology to the high-trust de-identification framework, and both say the same thing. Controls and transformation are exchangeable, and the exchange must be documented. The secure enclave deserves its own slide because it is the single control that most changes what you can leave in the data, so you should be able to describe one precisely. 4 properties define it. Property 1, no local copy. The analyst never receives the file. They receive an account. The data lives on infrastructure the custodian or a trusted intermediary controls, and it never lands on a laptop, a departmental server, or a personal cloud drive. That single fact removes most of the loss scenarios in your threat model, because a file that was never transferred cannot be stolen from a recipient's environment. Property 2, remote access with the exits closed. The analyst works through a remote desktop or virtual workspace and runs statistical software normally, but the operating system disables removable media, disables printing, disables clipboard transfer between the enclave and the local machine, and disables direct file export. Exfiltration is engineered away rather than promised away, which is the difference between a control and a clause. Property 3, output review. Nothing leaves except through a gate, and at that gate, someone applies the cell size rule to tables, charts, and model output. Property 4, monitored logs with a human who reads them, so that a researcher suddenly running record-level queries against rare diagnoses triggers a question rather than a log entry. Now the payoff, stated in the currency your client cares about. Because the enclave drives the attempt probability genuinely low, you can retain what public release would destroy. Exact dates of service rather than quarters. Longitudinal sequencing, so encounters stay in true order with true intervals. Specific ICD-10 diagnosis codes rather than collapsed chapters. That is what the control bought, and your report should name it. Let us release our fully synthetic Springfield extract twice and see what the thresholds actually do. Release 1, public. Adopt the public benchmark, maximum risk 0.09, which needs a minimum class size of 11. Springfield has 10 records. A class can never be larger than the file it lives in, so K of 11 is not merely hard here, It is arithmetically unreachable. No generalization, no suppression, no cleverness gets a 10-row file to a class of 11. So microdata release is off the table entirely, and the fallback is aggregate statistics only under the cell size suppression policy. Run that fallback, and it fails too. In the raw sex by payer table, every cell is a 1, a 2, or a 3, all inside the 1 to 10 band, so the entire table masks and nothing publishes. That is the honest result, and some requests simply have no public answer. Release 2, the enclave. Adopt 0.20, which needs a minimum class size of 5. Apply the transformations from video 12, age to 10-year bands, zip 5 to zip 3, admit date to quarter, and suppression of the 94-year-old outlier. 9 records remain in 3 classes. The 30 to 39 female class in zip 3627 holds 5 records, R01, R02, R03, R09, and R10, so its risk is 1 over 5, exactly 0.20. It lands precisely on the threshold, which passes a rule stated as at most, and that is worth noticing rather than glossing. The other 2 classes hold 2 records each, R04 with R05 and R07 with R08 at 1/2. Even merging those 2 classes leaves 4 records, short of 5. Those 4 records force further action. Everything in this module converges on one design decision, the balance between controls and transformation, and the professional obligation is to strike it explicitly. The logic runs like this. Transformation protects unconditionally. Generalized data stays generalized even if every contract fails and every server is breached. Controls protect conditionally. They lower the attempt probability while they hold and only while they hold. So the balance point depends on how much you trust the conditions and on what the data must still accomplish. A longitudinal outcome study dies without exact dates, so the defensible design is date-shifted data, richer than public release would ever allow, inside an enclave, under a full clause data use agreement, at a threshold you justify from the controlled release precedents and grade honestly as practice derived. A public dashboard has no controls to lean on, so the design is aggressive generalization. Cell size 11 suppression on every table with complementary suppression worked properly and the strict public thresholds. The framework, endorsed across the practitioner literature from LMAM's methodology to the high-trust de-identification framework, is not controls or transformation, it is a documented allocation between them. 3 sentences belong in every report you will ever write. Here is the balance we chose. Here is why this context supports it. Here is what happens if the context changes. And that last sentence has teeth, because when the recipient's environment degrades, when the agreement lapses, when the enclave becomes a download, the determination does not stretch to cover the new situation. It expires, and the analysis must be redone. Write the expiry condition into the report, name it, and give it a review date. Here is the ordered written sequence that makes a threshold defensible, 7 steps, and the order is load-bearing because each step is the premise of the next. Step 1. Identify the release model and the use case, public domain or controlled by agreement, and who the anticipated recipients are. Step 2. Formally adopt the adversary model or models, prosecutor, journalist, marketer, and state whether you evaluate at the maximum or the average, tied to Step 1. Step 3. Evaluate the context and state your conclusion on the probability of an attempt, using the 5 safes as the structural guide, cataloging the administrative controls by clause and the technical controls by architecture, and concluding in words that a deliberate breach or insider attack is minimal. Say plainly that this is a reasoned conclusion, not a measured rate. Step 4. Select and cite the numeric threshold for the probability of success. If you are using cell size 11, cite the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services suppression policy and the California guidelines, and note that 0 is publishable while 1 through 10 are masked. If you are using 0.09 or 0.05, cite policy 0070 or the Canadian Discharge Abstract Database work. Grade the provenance in the report itself. Step 5. Document the transformation, the specific algorithms, generalization of ZIP5 to ZIP3, age coarsening, date coarsening, record suppression, and the complementary suppression applied to any tabular output. Step 6. Document the estimator, naming the sampling fraction, the decision rule, and the estimator it selected, so journalist risk constraints are demonstrably satisfied rather than assumed. Step 7. The formal attestation, that on generally accepted statistical and scientific principles, in this specific context, and against reasonably available information, the risk is very small. That paragraph is yours to adapt, and I want you to notice its architecture rather than its wording. It states the release model in the first sentence before any number appears. It names the controls it relies on specifically: export, print, and removable media disabled, not the phrase securely stored. It draws the context conclusion in words. It then gives the threshold, immediately translated into its cell size equivalent, so the reviewer does not have to do the division. And it closes with the counterfactual, what the threshold would have been for a public release, which quietly proves you knew the stricter benchmark and chose against it deliberately rather than out of ignorance. That last sentence prevents more arguments than any other. Now the 2 challenges reviewers actually raise. Challenge 1. Why not 0.05? Your answer is not that 0.05 is wrong. It is that 0.05 is the peer-reviewed benchmark for public use microdata, where the attempt probability is 1.0, and this is not a public release, so applying a public benchmark to a controlled release would misstate the threat model. Then point to the controls. Challenge 2. Where does 0.20 come from? Cite it. Answer honestly, using the grading from earlier. It is practice-derived, described in the methodological literature as an allowance for highly secure restricted access environments, and it is not codified in regulation the way cell size 11 is. Then argue the product, that the overall risk after multiplying by the assessed attempt probability sits well below the public benchmark. An expert who concedes the weaker provenance and wins on the product is far more credible than one who oversells the citation and loses both. 3 takeaways from today. First, thresholds are defended, never asserted, and defending means grading. Traced and strong, cell size 11 from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in California. 0.09 from Clinical Trial Transparency. 0.05 from the Canadian Public Microdata Literature. Traced and moderate, the legacy cell sizes of 3 and 5. Commonly repeated and untraced for identity, the 33% rule, which traces to the P% rule for business magnitude data in Working Paper 22. And practice-derived rather than codified, the 0.20 enclave figure, which this course uses and which you should describe honestly. Second, cell size and probability are one statement in 2 languages. 1 over 11 is 0.0909. 1 over 20 is 0.05, and a strictly enforced 0.09 ceiling actually needs a class of 12. Suppression is not just masking, it is complementary masking, because a row total plus subtraction recovers any single hidden cell, as our 100 record Springfield table showed, and collapsing categories often preserves more than blanket masking. Third, controls and transformation trade-off. The trade is documented, and it has an expiration condition. When the enclave becomes a download, the determination does not stretch, it dies. Module 4 complete. You can now measure risk, model adversaries, convert thresholds, and defend a number in writing. Module 5 is the re-identification case canon, Governor Weld, Netflix, the 99.98% study, what actually happened and what each attack teaches. Subscribe so it reaches you, and the roadmap is at subthesis.com.